Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel, and in today's video, I'll show you how I made this farmhouse style console table. This table has the X on the sides for the classic farmhouse look, and I'll show you exactly how I made that X in this video. I'll actually take you through every step that I did to make this entire table, so stick around because you won't want to miss this. If you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe so you won't miss out on any upcoming videos, and with that said, let's get into it. So starting things off, I cross-cut all the pieces to make the frame for the table. So here I'm making the legs and the leg frames, and I usually make the side frames first and then the rest of the table. So I'm just using regular 2x4s here. This is pine wood. You could use whatever you wanted, but 2x4s are what I chose for this. And if you want to make this table for yourself, you can find all the dimensions in the description. Just keep in mind that you can make these to basically any dimension or any size that you want, so you don't necessarily have to follow the dimensions that I used. So I ended up with 4 legs and 5 support pieces. One of the support pieces will be ripped in half to become the center support. You'll see that in a minute. But I attached the side frames to the legs by drilling pocket holes, which would allow me to put a screw in the frame into the legs. I'm using the Kreg K4 jig to drill these pocket holes. If you've watched any of my other videos, you'll see that I use this tool pretty frequently. This makes drilling pocket holes very easy, and it's a very efficient method. So here's the 5th middle frame piece. Like I mentioned, I ripped this in half right down the middle, and then I had a center frame piece for each side. This had to be slimmer in order to make room for the X piece that would go in the side frame. This will all make sense later, but we'll get to that later in the video. Once everything was cut, I laid all the pieces out. So on the top, the support piece will be flush with the top of the legs, and on the bottom, I used this scrap piece of 2x4 to measure a gap that would be consistent on each side. So I then was able to assemble all the pieces using glue and screws from the pocket holes. You'll notice that I'm using my square to ensure that everything is lined up properly. I would highly recommend using a square unless you want your table to look like something that's in a Dr. Seuss book. Now, I personally have no issues with Dr. Seuss, but I typically like everything that I make to set level, so I try to use the square to make sure everything lines up. So because I used screws, I didn't have to let the glue dry. I took the clamps off immediately, and then I was able to move to the center brace piece. So I measured the distance between the top and the bottom, and then I was able to put the center piece right in the middle. It was a tad too long, so I used the classic solution of hitting it with a hammer until it was in place, and then I was able to secure it with pocket holes. One thing to note here is that the pocket holes on the middle and the bottom piece are facing downward, and on the top it's facing upward. That way the pocket holes will never be seen when the table is completely finished. So when the frame was finished, I mirrored what I had just made, and I ended up with 2 of these frames. After the side frames were finished, I cross-cut 2x4s to make the front and the back apron. So I cut 3 2x4s to length, and then I ripped each one right down the middle, giving me 6 pieces altogether. So whenever I rip the 2x4s, I rip them about 2/3 of the way through, then I turn the saw off, flip the board over, and then rip the board the rest of the way through. With my setup, I feel like this is the safest way for me to do this. If you use this method, just make sure you hold on to the inside piece at all times. Otherwise, you risk kickback where that board is pinched between the fence and the saw blade. You could always use 2x2s instead of ripping a 2x4 in half as well. 2x4s are more cost effective, so that's why I choose to use this method. I wanted the shelving slats to sit flush with the apron on the middle and the bottom frames, so I cut a groove in some of the apron pieces using a straight bit on my router table. I had to make a couple passes on this because I couldn't cut the slot deep enough in one pass, but I used the straight bit and I cut this little groove that allowed the slats to set down inside of the shelf. So I did this on the bottom and the middle of the shelves. I didn't have to do this on the top because obviously there's no shelf slats that set down within the grooves. So here's a quick look at what the apron piece looks like after that groove is cut. So it should come as no surprise that I used pocket holes to attach these apron pieces to the side frames. So I drilled a pocket hole, again using the K4 jig, and these pocket holes will go on the opposite side of where I cut the groove for the shelves. If you find yourself interested in this K4 jig, you can find a link to it in the description, as well as all the other tools that I used in this video. Once the side frames and the aprons were cut out, it was time to assemble them. The easiest way that I've found to do this is to use bar clamps clamping across and then gluing the apron pieces in together, and then you can attach them with the pocket holes. The bar clamps will really keep everything sturdy as you assemble this. Once again, you want to make sure that everything is square and lined up. This will help everything come together much more nicely in the end. Also, at this point, make sure that the gap on the middle brace is facing outward, which will allow room for the X to go into place. So if you look where I'm pointing, you'll notice that the apron is recessed a little bit inside of the leg frame. And I do this because the leg and apron pieces are not milled square. So that curve on the edge of each piece will look a little bit better if the apron piece is recessed backwards. This is a sneaky trick that I'll use from time to time that keeps that ugly gap from showing whenever you're using lumber that isn't milled. So after the first two apron pieces were on, I found it easier to stand the table frame upward and then put the other apron pieces in that way. I did put one of the other apron pieces in the bottom just to kind of temporarily hold everything in place. Then I put bar clamps across the piece I was working on and secured it in place with pocket holes. As long as you have a clamp holding pressure, it's okay to tap the apron piece with a hammer to get it perfectly in place. Just make sure to recess all of the apron pieces like we did on the very bottom in the first step. That way they'll all line up perfectly. I believe I'm using 3-inch construction screws on this step. You can use pocket hole specific screws for this, which would probably work a little bit better. I just use normal screws since they're cheaper. As long as you don't oversink the screws too far, you shouldn't run into any problems. So with the final apron piece in place, I was able to wipe off the excess glue, flip the table over, and then at this point, the frame is starting to resemble an actual table. So the shelves on this table would be made from slats. So I measured the distance across the shelf, and then I made the slats from 2x4s. So normally I would use 3/4 inch appearance board or furring strips to make the slats for shelves. But when I went to the store to get these, a 1x board was actually the same exact price as a 2x board, which makes absolutely no sense. So in order to avoid paying the same price for half the amount of lumber, I just decided to resaw the 2x4s down the middle. So this homemade fence on my bandsaw probably isn't the greatest setup of all time, but it actually did work to resaw the board right down the middle pretty well. So after way more work and way more time invested, I had made enough slats from the 2x4s to make up the shelves for this. If you don't have a bandsaw, you could always use 1x boards instead. I just wanted to take something simple and make it way more complicated, so that's what I did by resawing these. So the surfaces on these slats were a little rough and my fence wasn't exactly centered, so I ran everything through the planer not only to flatten the slats out, but to also get them the same width for when I put them into the shelves. Surprisingly, the surfaces of these turned out really well after they were planed and sanded down. I was surprised by how well the inside of a 2x4 could actually be used for an appearance board with a good surface. So to put these slats in, I wanted everything to have equal spacing. Now I normally don't measure, but since I had an odd number of slats, I found the exact center and then I attached the first slat in there, and then I was able to just base everything on the outsides off of that middle slat since I knew it was exactly in the center. So the slats are attached with glue underneath and then brad nails from the top, and they're thin enough that wood movement shouldn't be a concern. So because they're a little bit thinner and not as deep, there won't be as much stress within them compared to a large tabletop or a much thicker board, and because of this, wood movement shouldn't be that big of a concern with the individual slats. So if you don't like the look of slats used as shelves, you could always use appearance board or a 1x board to make the shelving. I find slats easier to work with, and I think they give everything a little bit more character, so that's why I use these more frequently than solid pieces for the shelves of my tables. Also, if you don't have a router table or you weren't able to cut the groove for these slats to set down in, you could always just put them across the full length of the apron and then nail them right down on the top. So before I made the top or put the X's in, I wanted to cut slots in the top to attach the tabletop with Z-clips. So I'm using the slot cutter in my router to cut some slots out that the Z-clips will fit inside of. It would be easier to do this on the apron pieces with a table saw prior to putting them together. I usually always forget to do this, so my slot cutter and the router makes quick work of these. We'll look at putting the Z-clips in a little bit later in this video. So at this point, before we have the top on and the X's in the sides to make everything difficult to reach, now is a good time to sand. So I sanded everything down to 120. I hate sanding just as much as everyone else, but sanding everything down really will make it look a lot better than if you leave the surfaces rough. If you're in the market for a new sander with great dust collection, check out the Rotex sander. There's virtually no dust when it's hooked up to the vacuum, and it definitely cuts my sanding time down. So to make the X pieces, I first measured across the table side frame diagonally, and then I ripped a 2x4 in half right down the middle, which would be the pieces that make up the X. Normally I'll leave these pieces a couple inches long so that I have plenty to work with. In this case, I found a 2x4 that was the exact length, so I just used it instead. Now rather than measure the angle and then try to mark the angle on the board, I'm actually going to clamp these into place, and then I'll go on the inside and I'll actually trace over the overlap, which gives me the perfect angle in each corner of these. A little trick that I like to do is to mark each corner with where it goes. That way you won't get these upside down or backwards, which will throw them off when you try to put them back in place. Here's what the angles look like after they're measured, and then I like to cut these off with the miter saw. Now, a lot of tables that I've seen made this way will only measure the angle on one side and then cut that side off. That will work fine. I just think it looks a little bit better when both angles are cut off. And this is twice as much work as only doing it on one side, so this is right up my alley. Once you have the corners cut off of both pieces, you can pop them in place and then trace the overlap on the center, similarly to how we did on the outside angles. Here's what the middle pieces look like when you have that angle marked. So I like to use the trench setting on my miter saw to cut this out. This is a half lap joint in the middle, so we'll cut halfway through each board, then they'll overlap in the middle and they should be flush on each end. Since the blade is curved, I put some scrap pieces behind the board that I'm cutting. That way it'll reach the bottom part of the blade as I cut in the middle. Take your time and go slow on this step, making sure you're cutting downward and not pulling the board across the saw blade. Probably not necessary, but I like to clean the joints out with a file or sandpaper just to clean them up and get rid of the rough surfaces before I glue them together. Once the joints are clean, you can then put glue down and then use a hammer to take out any frustrations you have. I mean, gently tap them together until they're secured in place. So with the X pieces assembled, you can put the X piece in the frame by just tapping it in. It might need influence with a hammer, but after a few hits, the X piece is secure inside the frame. As I mentioned earlier, it helps to mark each corner. That way you don't get the X pieces mixed up when you put them inside the frame. Once the X piece is in, I secure each end of the X to the frame by using screws through the side frame supports. Not only does this hold the X pieces in place, but the X pieces crossed in the middle will actually give the outside of the table a little extra support. And with the frame fully assembled, it was time to get started on the top. So for the top, I used two 2x12s, and I first planed them down to give them a little bit better of a surface. If you look closely in this shot, one thing you'll notice is that I really need to clean my shop up. So if you look around, you'll notice all kinds of stuff, like the bicycle behind me, just in case I need to go for a ride in between cutting boards. So in case you haven't subscribed already, be sure to go ahead and do that. That way you can find out if I ever clean my shop up. Spoiler alert, it's probably not going to happen anytime soon. Now, where was I? Oh yeah. So after I planed each of the tabletop pieces down, I first ripped one edge off of them to get a straight edge. Then I moved the fence in just a little bit and I ripped the other edge off. This gave me a better joint for them to glue together with. So while the new edge wasn't perfect, it was still a lot better than the factory rough edge that comes when the board's before they're ripped. So to join these together, I used pocket holes on each board. So I lined them up on the best edge, and then I staggered the boards, marking a pencil mark on each board to where the pocket holes would be offset. Next, I used the K4 jig to drill holes, and then the screws can be put in place between the boards to hold them together. Now, I've got to be honest with you, I don't really like this method at all. I would prefer to just glue the boards together without drilling pocket holes, but I was trying to get the top done quickly without waiting for it to dry until the next day, so I decided to use this method. It works fine and there's nothing at all wrong with it. I just don't like how the pocket holes show on one side. So when I make a top, I like to have both surfaces available after the boards are glued together before I choose which surface will actually be the top. Using pocket holes really takes one side out of the option since the pocket holes are able to be seen. So regardless of whether or not I like the method that I'm currently using, I put the top boards together, put them in between bar clamps, threw a clamp on the side, and then I put the screws in the pocket holes, which secured the boards together. The screws will hold the boards in place tightly together almost immediately, so there's no need to let the boards stay in the clamps for an extended time to dry. So with the boards held together by the screws, I was able to immediately go to the next steps of getting the tabletop to look like an actual tabletop rather than just two boards glued together. So as I'm sanding the top down here, you may notice that the ends of the boards are flush in this shot where they weren't in the last shot. That's because I forgot to hit the record button on the camera when I flush cut those. So real quick, we'll jump to another dimension of a different video and I'll show you how I did that. So here we are in a different video. Use your imagination and pretend that this tabletop is the tabletop we've been watching. Anyway, all I did was use the track saw to flush cut the ends on this.
Now, if you don't have a track saw, you could definitely use a circular saw for this. I'm pretty poor skill-wise using the circular saw, which is why I choose to use the track saw instead. So with the ends of the tabletop flush cut, let's jump to light speed and head back to our normal video. So here we are, and the best part about that was that you didn't have to listen to me say anything about sanding, because we all know how much fun sanding is. So next, I took a round over bit in my router, and I routed the edges of the tabletop. The router is pretty loud, and if you look in the bottom right corner, you can see that my earmuffs are being used super effectively to keep the noise of the router down. But at least I'm wearing goggles and a mask, so 2 out of 3 isn't bad, right? If you actually answered that out loud, I probably wouldn't have been able to hear you over the noise of the router. So after the edges of the top were all fancied up with a router, I sanded everything down one final last time, and I took the top to 220. I then used my orbital sander to get the edges and the corners of this. The Rotex sander is a little too aggressive for this, so I like my orbital sander for the edges and the corners. You obviously don't have to do this, but I think it's a nice gesture to take off any of the sharp edges and round everything over for a soft edge. And apparently I felt the need to sand everything down even more, which is great. I was hoping to be finished with sanding by now, but it seems like sanding is a never-ending task. So I stained the table with Minwax Puritan Pine. I won't spend too much time going over the stain because I have a separate video on this stain where I cover everything in detail, but I wanted to make sure you got your money's worth out of this free video, so I did include the staining process. So I stained it with the Puritan Pine and then went over it with a Satin polyurethane. Here are the Z-clips going into the slots that I mentioned earlier. So I do this to allow for wood movement as the top expands and contracts. The Z-clips will allow for movement and the wood won't crack under stress. I normally throw some clamps on just to keep the top in place while I put the screws in through the Z-clips, so they're not actually clamping the top downward, they're just keeping it from moving. Then I'll put some screws in the Z-clips. Make sure that your screws are not too long, otherwise they'll go through the top, which would be really bad at this point. So with the top secured in place, that would wrap up the last step, and then the table was completely finished. Here's some final pictures of how everything turned out. I'm pretty happy overall with it, and I think it turned out awesome. So leave a comment below and let me know what you think. If you enjoyed this video and you found the information useful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. If you didn't enjoy this video, like, share, and subscribe anyways. And if you decide to make this for your own, send me a picture of what your creation looked like on Instagram. You can find me on the same name as my YouTube channel. As always, thanks for watching and stay tuned for more.